mentioned, I am Brother Richard Merling. I have been previously the director of the Father Solanus Guild, as well as one of the vice postulators for the cause of Solanus Casey. Now, the director of the Father Solanus Guild, of course, has been the group of people really that have been promoting Solanus' cause since 1960. I wasn't working with them all that time, but I started in 1973. I was asked to assist them. And then, of course, basically it was through the guild, the Father Solanus Guild, that the people there and around the city of Detroit started off by promoting his cause or making him known to many thousands of people throughout the country. And it was kind of interesting because as the guild started, they started with a few chapters within the city area, and some 6 months later they had some 24 chapters throughout the country. So it spread far and wide, and we were very delighted to hear of that and how the interest took hold to people's in reference to his having a devotion to him. And so with that, in 1973, I was stationed in Detroit and was asked to take care of that, of the promotion of Solanus' cause. I'd like to probably begin with a little bit of the history of Father Solanus and his family and so forth. His parents came over from Ireland in around 1860, unknown to one another. And they attended a parish picnic and met and fell in love. And of course then they went on, and some few years later they ended up getting married. And it was kind of interesting though, Solanus' mother, it would be actually Solanus' grandmother, wasn't too excited about her daughter thinking about getting married right away. So anyways, she ended up sending her daughter out to Wisconsin with some other relatives. They were living in Massachusetts at the time. And but anyways, it ends up that the daughter ends up wanting to really marry this young man that she had met. And so finally the mother gives in, and the daughter comes back to Massachusetts and ends up marrying the young man that she was in love with. And so anyways, with that then they decided to, of course, move around in the east area, the east coast a little bit, and then they decided to go back out to Wisconsin where they settled. And the reason why I kind of bring that into the fact is the fact that that's where the Casey family then grew up. And there was 16 children in the family. Father Solanus was the sixth oldest of the 16. When he was 6 years of age, there was a diphtheria that had hit the country, and 2 of the children had passed away within a few days' time. He had 2 sisters. One was an older sister and one was a younger sister. And so that was quite an experience for him to go through with the family. As time went on, Father Solanus was a very young man, enjoyed life, and he did a lot of farming and things of this sort. And then it ended up that he he wanted to go off and get another type of job. And so he ends up going off into the big city, you might say, into Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And there he ends up becoming a streetcar conductor. And one evening, while he was on the streetcar, he witnessed a murder, a killing of a young lady. And it was a very shocking thing to him. And so with that, he decided that he must dedicate his life to God in helping other people out. And with that, he ends up going to his parish priest, pastor, asking for some direction and how he might go on to the seminary and so forth. And so they directed him to the seminary down in Milwaukee. And it was a German-speaking seminary, and he himself, of course, was of an Irish background. And so it was rather difficult. He struggled with that. And as he went through school for 6 years, he struggled. And at the end of the 6 years, the director of the seminary suggested that maybe he might leave there and maybe go to a religious community where he could become a brother and perhaps wouldn't have to go through all the studies, being that he knew that Solanus, or young Barney Casey, Bernard Barney, wanted to dedicate his life to God. And so after that time in the seminary and being disappointed to the fact that they wouldn't accept him or allow him to go through, he inquires with a number of religious communities, and one of them was the Capuchins in Detroit. And so he was uncertain as to where he might go with this. So he makes a novena to the Blessed Mother, 9-day novena that was to end on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December the 8th. And he asked his oldest sister to make that novena with him. And so at the 9th day of that novena, he heard a voice speak to him, "Go to Detroit. Go to Detroit." With that, he knew that that's what he was to do. He was to join the Capuchins in Detroit. He began to make plans within the next couple weeks, and his parents were quite concerned because he was wanting to go before Christmas. And so he was all ready by December the 21st, and he told his parents that he was going on to Detroit to join the Capuchins. Of course, in those days, travel wasn't the greatest. It was horse and buggy up to a train station, and then from the train station on of several days to get to Detroit. And so he arrives in Detroit on December the 24th at Christmas Eve around 6:30 in the evening. I'm just going to interrupt here because of the fact that occasionally when I'm speaking about it, I must admit that I do get a little emotional about it because I just find it as such a wonderful story, a beautiful story, how God is speaking to this man in his life and directs him to what he ends up being, such a powerful person in the hands of God. And with that, Solanus goes to Detroit, and he arrived, like I said, about 6:30 in the evening. It was dark and cold out, and the friar took him to we referred to our rooms in those days as cells, and brought him to his cell, and told him that this is where he could stay and so forth, and that there would be a midnight mass. And so anyways, he went in and he fell off to sleep. And around 11:30 in the evening, he heard the friars getting together, singing Christmas carols, and they would walk down the hallway. And as they would pass by a friar's room, that friar would come out then and join them. And so that's what happened, was to the fact that when they came by his room, he opened his door and went out and joined them and went down to midnight mass. And he said he was at peace for the rest of his years. That was a great event for him, and it settled him to the fact that, yes, this is where I am to be. And so he went off into school, and again, though, he runs into that same problem because we were of a German province, and he had run into that difficulty of the Milwaukee Seminary of being German, and so he struggled with his classes and schooling, and so he ends up then at the time of finishing up with his classes, the director of the seminary said, we're afraid that maybe you haven't grasped everything that was taught. And so it ends up that they then ask him, or have arranged for the fact of him to be ordained as a simplex priest. Okay, to speak a little more directly into it. Okay. All right. Thank you. So with that, he was going to be ordained as a simplex priest. Simplex priest is basically one who would be able to say Mass. He would not be able to hear confessions or to preach a homily, a theological homily. And so he was restricted basically for what he could do. And so with that, they sent him out to a parish after his ordination out to New York, to Sacred Heart in Yonkers, New York. And he was out there in New York for about a good 20 years or so. But his first assignment was there to Sacred Heart. And basically they just had him saying Mass. They didn't know exactly what to do with him. They assigned him to be the porter, the one that would answer the door, to take care of the needs of people that were coming there. And so with that, he ends up becoming quite popular with the people that came to the door. And they would often say to him, Father, would you pray for this or that? And he says, oh yes, I will pray for that. Or would you come out to the house and visit my sick parent, or my brother or sister, and whoever might be sick in the family? And he said yes, and he'd go out and visit them. Well, wonderful things were happening. They noticed that this man, whoever he visited, and the request of their prayers was taking place. And so with that, he ends up, the superiors, after some 13 years there at Sacred Heart in Yonkers, they said, let's transfer him to another place. So they transferred him to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he was there at the parish for 3 years. Same things were happening around his life. So then they said, well, maybe we should transfer him again, let's see if this is what we think it is. And so they transferred him on up to another parish on the east side of New York. And he was there for 3 years, and the same thing repeated itself. His holiness, how he was able to help people out, touched their lives. So the superiors back in Detroit said, well, let's bring him back here to Detroit, see what's happening. Well, our house chronicler on a daily basis would write what was happening within the community. And on this particular day, after Solanus had been there for some 15 days or so, writes in there, Father Solanus arrived here in Detroit some 15 days ago. Up to this time, we might have anywhere from 10 to 15 people a day come to the monastery door, asking for Mass attentions or something of some assistance in some way or another. And so it ends up that after the 15 days, the house chronicler writes, Father Solanus has been here 2 weeks. We now have well over 200 people a day coming. Word of mouth got around the city that there was this holy man there. And the rest of it was history. People just flocked to the monastery to come to visit Father Solanus with their various situations in their life, asking for prayer and help. Now, some of these incidences was a young family who came in with their little child who was 6 years of age, and the father was carrying the child, the little boy, and we had probably a waiting room, almost at least maybe 2/3 the size of this room here, where they had chairs sitting around the outside walls of the room. And the desks were up over here. There was 2 desks. There was one for Father Solanus and one for his helper. And the helper usually took care of
if someone wanted a mass intention said or something of that sort, then they would take care of that for them, for the person that was coming in. And then Father Solanus would often listen to the stories that people had to tell him and were asking for special prayers, for things in their lives. And so with this young family came in and they sat down in the chairs waiting for their turn to come. And when it did come, just the mother got up and came over to the desk and spoke to Father Solanus and said, "Our son is 6 years of age and he hasn't walked since birth." And he listened to her tell the story. And when she finished, he simply looked over at the child and said, "Come here, little boy." She spoke up, "Father, I told you, he doesn't walk." He said, "Come here, little boy." The child got off the father's lap and walked over to the desk where Father Solanus was, probably a good 10, 12 feet away. So they were totally amazed at that. Another incident was to the fact that there was a lady who came into the office one day with her 2 children, her daughter and son. And when it came time for her to come up to Father Solanus, of course, they sat down there in front of him. And he said they said to him, that they were there asking for prayers for her husband, who was seriously ill in the hospital. And they were afraid that he might die. And so he listened to her story. When she finished, she said, "Father," she says, "if I were to get my husband on the phone, would you talk with him in the hospital?" And he said, "Yes, he could do that." So anyways, they made an arrangement so that they could get the patient to speak with Father Solanus on the phone. So Father Solanus says, "John," he says, "I want to let you know that I'm praying that you do have a happy death." The lady was dumbfounded to hear him say that. So anyways, after he talked with him for a few minutes, he hung up and he said to his wife, "This is what God is asking of your husband at this time, and as of you as well, that he go to the Lord. And everything will be all right for you and your children. They'll be taken care of." And so with that, the wife left the desk, went to the hospital, visited her husband, and he was at tremendous peace. And he simply said to her that, he was ready to go, that God will take care of him, and God will take care of you too, his wife and the children. And so another incident, just how Father Solanus was able to enter into people's lives, into the situations that they were there to pray for. Another family comes in with 2 children. It was during the summer months. Prior to their coming into the monastery office, there was one of the young friars who was to go off to the dentist. He was to have a couple teeth extracted. And in those days, it was quite a serious thing. In fact, sometimes they would end up having to be spending a night in the hospital. And so with that great concern, this friar comes by Father Solanus and says, "Yes, Father, I have to go to the dentist, and I have to have a couple teeth extracted." And of course, the young friar was in his novitiate, and he would end up missing maybe a day from the monastery, a night. And he says, "I'm going to have to start it all over again if I have to go into the hospital for this." And he said, he just kind of tapped him on the cheek. And he said, "I'm sure everything will be all right." Well, the brother goes off to the dentist. In the meantime, there's this young family who comes in with 2 little children carrying 2 ice cream cones. And the parents walked up to Father at the desk and simply said, "These are ice cream cones that we thought you might like to have one, and your helper over here at the other desk to have one." And Father Solanus said, "Oh, thank you." He says, "Yeah, we'll have those a little later on." So he opens up the drawer and puts the 2 ice cream cones in there. Brother Leo, who's sitting over at the other desk, is like, oh my Lord, what a mess we're going to have. Well, it ended up that as time went on, this brother returns from the dentist and says, guess what, Father? I don't have to have these teeth extracted. Everything's all right. And he says, well, I think we should celebrate. So he opens up the drawer and pulls out 3 ice cream cones. Not two melted ones, but 3 full ice cream cones. Brother Leo said he could just never get over that. He says it was just a tremendous event for him, and seeing the faith and the trust in God that Father Solanus had, and the knowledge that he had, that this young little boy, or young friar, who was probably about in his late teens or so, didn't have to worry. Things were going to be all right for him. So there were many incidences of this that went on in Solanus' life there at St. Bonaventure's. He was a great man of great prayer. In our friar's chapel, it holds probably about 40 people in all. And there's this huge crucifix up over the altar. And Father Solanus used to go in there and pray before that crucifix. And many a times, Father Solanus would spend the whole night in prayer before this crucifix. And the next morning, when the friar who was assigned to open up the church would come across Father Solanus fast asleep on the floor, and he would kind of shake him, awaken him, and simply say, Father, you better get up. You shouldn't have been sleeping on the floor. And Father Solanus said, oh, I slept on the soft side of the boards. And so anyways, he always had a little comment of jovialty to be able to tell people of something. And so anyways, there was that incident. And then as well, the friars would go into chapel and to their choir area, and we had seating around the edges of the wall. And for Father Solanus' space where he would sit, that they had arranged for a special little button to push, so that when he was being called to the front office, he would hear that. He would just push this button to let the front office know that he was being, that he heard and that he will be there shortly. So anyways, that was one of the things that often would happen, you know. He would hear his voice, or hear his name being called to come to the front office, so he would push that button and let them know, and he'd get up and leave prayer. There's other little stories told of Father Solanus and his prayer when he would be praying before the Blessed Sacrament, the cross there of Christ, and he would be in a trance. And it would be sometimes during the day when he would be doing this, and one of the friars, the younger friars, would be assigned to clean the chapel. And so they had a mop, and they had to push it around and dust the place up. And so when Father Solanus was there, the friar always had to take the mop and go out around him and things like that. So anyways, this one friar, whose turn it was, said, Father, I can't dust the whole church, the whole chapel, because Father Solanus is kneeling there praying. And the friar, the novice master, told the young man, just dust around him. Everything will be all right. So anyways, that's what they would do. They would just dust around Father Solanus as he knelt there in prayer before the Eucharist. There are just literally thousands of stories that have been told to us and that we have recorded. And I myself have somewhat of a personal story insofar as a story of our family. I have an older brother that was in a serious auto accident, injured his leg, and they were going to amputate it. My mother, who had known Father Solanus, maybe just to step back to the fact of telling you of the connection of my mother's family and the Casey family, was to the fact that my grandfather's brother, who would be my mother's uncle, married Solanus's oldest sister, Ellen, the one that he was very close to. And so I kind of feel that there's been a kind of a close connection there with that. But so my mother would go down to the monastery and visit with Father Solanus. And then, of course, when he was moved away, was growing up and I didn't see too much of him really, or had always heard about him. And then when I was 15 years of age, I had an older brother who was 19, was in a serious auto accident, injured his leg to the point where they were going to amputate it. My mother said, let's go down and see Father Solanus, because he had come back to Detroit, that is. And so we went down there on a Sunday afternoon and visited with him, told him about my brother, and he said, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And so we took that as to being everything's going to be all right. I kind of like to make that kind of change in the voice because of the fact that he did have a high-pitched voice. And it was, as older he got, it was like he kind of like, yes, everything's going to be all right. It's fine. And so anyways, we kind of picked up on that. But anyways, the next day then, my mother went into the hospital and the doctors came along and said, Mrs. Merling, we're not going to amputate your son's leg. We think everything's going to be all right. And sure enough, the leg did heal to the point to where it was not amputated. So we were always very, very, very grateful to that. But Solanus' life went on in such a way to where wherever he went, people come to know him and were always very touched and impressed with his life. It got to a point to where Father Solanus, in his time there in Detroit, they wanted to retire him. And so they said, well, let's move him back out to New York, to another parish where they wouldn't know him. And he'll get some rest out there. Well, after 9 months, they made the decision, I think we should move him someplace else, because crowds of people started coming back to him over there and way out in New York. And so they bring him back to Detroit just for a short while, and then they decided to have him transferred down to Huntington, Indiana, which was kind of somewhat out in the countryside, and it wasn't an easy place to get to and so forth. So they moved him down to Huntington, Indiana. Well, some people heard about Father Solanus being down there. Well, before you know it, there were busloads. There were 2 and 3, sometimes 4 Greyhound busloads a day that would be down there to Huntington, Indiana to see Father Solanus. And so it was a matter of you couldn't hide him at all. People were so aware of his presence and his love and his care for people in general. And so they just flocked to see him. Well, some 6 months before he died, he was then transferred back to Detroit, and that was at that time that my parents and I went down and asked for the blessing for my brother, and that took place. And then that was just about this time of year. It was the Sunday before Christmas of that year. And that was back in 1957. Oh, actually 56. The Christmas of 1956. And then in July of 1957, the first part of July, he was there in Detroit, and he had gotten quite sick. And so they decided to bring him back, to have him go into the hospital. And so the last month that he lived was at the hospital. And there he, of course, died. And we ourselves, our family, we were on a vacation at the time. We were in Upper Michigan, about 350 miles away. And we opened up the paper one morning and it said that Father Solanus Casey had died. My mother said, "We're packing up, we're going home. We're stopping our vacation, you know." So we went back down to Detroit and visited with him, or visit what do I want to say, the
Visitation.
prayer visitation. Thank you, the visitation for him, and and there was just thousands of people there. We had to wait an hour and a half, I think, before we got up and to see him in the casket. And the next day, my mother was hesitant. She said, "No," she said, "I don't think that we're going to go down to the funeral itself." She says, "There'll be too many people," and sure enough, they estimated that there was 10,000 people there for his funeral. So, and we have pictures of just crowds and crowds of people that are outside of the monastery waiting, you know, for the body to be brought out. And the monastery chapel itself in those days was probably holding about 400. And that was kind of the event of Father Solanus. And of course, through the years then, after his death, he became very well known to many people. People continued to pray and ask for his intercession, and many wonderful things have been granted. And so it's brought it to the point of his beatification, and now we will look forward to his canonization, which we are hoping will, within the next couple years. We're already getting many reports of healings. It's just wonderful, really. It's amazing how the numbers have increased. There's always been a good number of people who have been coming to his tomb on a daily basis, but it's tripled. And people from many parts of the country, as well as other parts of the world, they've heard of Father Solanus Casey, and they're coming there for prayer, asking of his intercession in their lives. And so with that, I think we kind of want to conclude, and I don't know if anybody had any questions or anything you wanted to ask, something? I think, yes?
Two things. One, what was the miracle that brought about his beatification? And two, didn't Solanus have something to do with you becoming a brother?
Excuse me, say that again?
Didn't Solanus Casey have something to do with your vocation?
Yes, I guess he did, yes. Maybe just to address that was to the fact when we were down there visiting, asking for prayers for my brother, for his healing, he, excuse me, he wanted to give us a blessing with the relic of the cross. And with that, he asked us to kneel down. And one of the things, though, in his conversation with us during that visit, he said, "You know," he said, "when I got this," he says, "when I entered the order, I didn't get to see my mother for 8 years." For me, that, you know, one in one ear and out the other. But my mother kind of thought, "Oh, that's terrible, you know, not seeing your son for 8 years." And anyways, it ends up that when we were ready to go, he asked us to kneel down and he would bless us. And he blessed each one of us with the relic of the cross, which we use here. And, excuse me, this evening it is his relic. But he would use the relic of the cross, and he blessed us. And when he came to me, he put his hand on my shoulder. And I don't remember it, but my mother did. It was a very impressive moment for her because she said, "Oh my God, he has him for the monastery and I won't see him for 8 years." So, anyways, little did I know that was happening. And so it ends up that I go off, continue on with school and working and so forth. And I was 22 years of age at the time, and I kind of said, you know, I made a retreat with the Holy Name Society one weekend. And I said, you know, I think I might want to enter religious life. My mother's heart sunk. She didn't say a word, but she said it to my sister and told her what had taken place at the time of our visit with Father Solanus. And so with that, here I am. So, and I was very privileged, of course, then to be asked to work with the actual cause for his beatification and canonization. Okay.
Just say two last thing. When I went to the monastery or to Detroit for the Mass, I was with a group of people from Cleveland, bus group, about 60 people. And when we went in the monastery in the morning, Mass was going to be at Ford Field in the afternoon. There was a black woman who came up to me out of nowhere and introduced herself as Paula from Panama. And I didn't know who she was. And we had a nice little conversation. She didn't say who she was. And then later that afternoon, I saw her taking Brother Richard's arm, walking up in front of the procession, because she was the miracle for the beatification. And she was raised in Panama. She had a very rare skin disease called ichthyosis. It leaves the skin like fish scales. It's a very rare genetic disease. And the scales on the skin would bleed. It was very painful. And she lived at the equator, so she would keep covered from head to toe, she said. And she was a teacher in a Catholic school and a catechist. And so she came on a pilgrimage from her Capuchin parish in Panama up to Detroit. She didn't know Father Solanus.
No.
And they told her about, she said, well, what's that table with the papers of Father Solanus? By the way, if you want to fill out a little prayer intention, put on his grave, give him to Brother, and he'll take it to Detroit with him. Okay? If you want to write down a little prayer intention. But she did that. There were all these papers on the grave, and so they told her what it was. She knelt down there. She filled out like 17 of these, none of them for herself, for her students and her family. And then the friar said, come on, Paul, it's time for lunch. So she got up to go to lunch, and as she's eating, she started to get nauseous, and this burning sensation over her whole body. And she excused herself. She went off to one of the guest rooms to take a nap. And as she's getting up from the nap, the scales on her skin are falling under the sheets. And she scoops up the scales and takes them down to show to the friars in the house. And they take her to a dermatologist in Detroit. And then she goes back to Panama to see her female dermatologist there. So when she saw her, she broke into tears. She said, only God could do that. There's no explanation for that. And back and forth medical exams and affirmations, and she was the one that was approved for the beatification. So the process is that we need now a miracle, a firm miracle after the beatification for the canonization. For Pope John Paul II, the miracle for his canonization actually occurred at the Mass for beatification. It was a French nun who had Parkinson's disease, and she was healed at the Mass in Rome for his beatification. So we're praying that that comes quickly for Father Solanus. And then lastly, I was a student in Cleveland in our seminary program in Wycliffe in 1987 when they exhumed, just before I visited the monastery, just before they took Father Solanus Casey's body out of the graveyard. They came from Rome to exhume the body to begin the process of canonization. And our superior at the time in Pittsburgh happened to be in Detroit because they coincided, the exhumation, official exhumation, coincided with the meeting of our Capuchin superiors in the United States in the monastery in Detroit. So they were there for it. And when they dug into the grave, they found that the cement vault that his coffin was in was cracked, and it was full of water. He had been embalmed in 1957, but they, of course, expected to find nothing in there. He'd been floating in water for 30 years. And I think Brother explained that he had a rheumatoid arthritis. You know, his hands were really crippled, and he had eczema over all his skin, and had another erysipelas, a skin disease, before he died in the hospital in Detroit in 1957. So he had terrible physical problems. So when they opened the, God, they expected to find nothing in there. The whole coffin lining, everything's tattered. But they said he looked like he was sleeping. They put a new habit on him. They said they combed his hair. The eczema was not on his skin. No arthritis in his hands. His blue Irish eyes, as blue as the day he closed in 1957, awaiting the resurrection. And I was there a few months ago with the friars for the with my family. Actually, we were up there for another event, and I asked Brother what condition the body was in, because they put him in a new coffin since the beatification with all of his dates on it. And he said he's the same.
Yeah.
He's the same. He looks like he's sleeping. And there's just no medical explanation for that. So there are just countless stories. I don't know if Brother told him about the files of the miracles.
No, I didn't, but yeah.
Well, I mean, the superior of their province ordered Father to keep track of these miracles that would happen on a daily basis. And he filled seven
notebooks. Yes.
Spiral-bound notebooks with 2-line comments, and he was not a good notator. They now make up about 5 or 6 volumes.
It is 5, yeah.
5
volumes.
They're that thick, printed, that thick, that big in the archives in Detroit. And we'll only know in heaven how many thousands of people were physically cured. I always said Padre Pio, the great miracle for Padre Pio was his work in the confessional, the tens of thousands of people. But because he had been prevented from hearing confessions, God gave him another special miracle. And those desperate people in Detroit during the Depression who had no, medical care wasn't what it is today. They had nothing. They were poor. And they were desperate. And God, in the midst of that, was less about Father Solanus and more about God's care for those people. And he did something for them that even doctors couldn't do in those days. Women would bring sick and dying children from St. John's Hospital to the monastery door, and they'd be lined up like the unemployment office or down Elliott Street, to see Father Solanus in those days. And I think one of the lasting legacies of Father Solanus is that he was not a bitter man. Because the way the order treated him, he could have been. He had every natural right to be bitter at us for the way he was limited and treated, but he was not. He was a transformed soul. And he was a vessel for all of this. And he used to say, too, and this is an important phrase of his, that, don't wait for God to do something for you to be grateful to him. Thank him ahead of time.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank him ahead. Understand, we have trust in God so much that you're willing to put him on the spot. Put God on the spot, he said. He called it divine spot putting. And he was so humble, because when these things started to happen in the monastery in Detroit, he would start to tear up, the people would say. He would get tears in his eyes, because he never attributed any of that to himself. It was always the power of God, right? And he would go from dawn to dusk, and he never rushed anybody. People would come into that office, the friars would be pushing, come on, Father, it's time for Vespers, it's time for dinner, and they'd be pushing. He would never rush anybody. Let them talk, let them tell their stories, whatever it was. He was a very patient man, and he was very humble. And I will tell you this, I gave a retreat to the Port Clare nuns up in Cleveland on Rocky River Drive, the Collatine Port Clare nuns. Maybe some of you know them, a couple of weeks ago. And one of the old sisters in that convent, she's 92 years old. And when I unraveled that banner in their chapel, she looked back like this. Father Solanus. She grew up in Detroit, and he healed her sister. 92 years old. I travel all over the place. I get Father Solanus stories told to me every place I go, every corner of this country. And I will tell you one last one for me, that about a month ago, I was at the bed of a dying woman in Maryland, near Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg. And this woman was the mother of a cloistered Carmelite nun at a monastery that's being built over there, the Carmelite nun from Nebraska, from Valparaiso. This woman was her mother. So I had been I collected a statue because I was going to give to those nuns a statue of Father Solanus, because a year ago I told them his story and they developed this big devotion to Father Solanus. So I called Mother and I said, I have the statue, I was going to run it over to your monastery. He said, Father, why are you calling today? And I said, it's just my day off, I'm going to bring it over. And she said, out of all days, she said, this is our last day of the novena. We've been praying to Father Solanus for Mary, the woman that was dying. And she had been completely out of it. For the night before, she had intermittent breathing. They were expecting her to go any second. And she had been out of the bed in weeks. And so I got there with the statue, excuse me, and I had Mass for their family right in the bedroom. And during the Mass, she perked up. We put one of the badges on her. And she perked up during the Mass. And she was able to receive viaticum. After the Mass, and this is a true story, she sat up in that bed and she's talking in a full conversation with her kids who had just arrived that day and they had thought they would never be able to say goodbye to their mother. And she sitting up in bed talking to her children. She had 8 children and they all had children. And they finally, they all just arrived. And she had this full-blown conversation with them. She was giving them marital advice. I kid you not, she's joking with them. Then she has to go into the front room and she's telling her husband what he should be doing with the grocery list that week. The children and the grandchildren come in front of me and they all kneel down and ask for my blessings. It's not me. You know. And her daughter was sitting on the bed with her mom who's dying of cancer. Her daughter's sitting on the bed, and she has a little baby girl. And she said, Father, I have a Father Solanus Casey story. This child is, because she was in utero at 40 weeks breech, and the doctors told us that they wouldn't deliver the baby. They couldn't turn it because it was too big, and that they were going to have to do surgery. And she said she and her husband didn't want to have surgery because they wanted to have more children. And she said, they cut off, they said a procedure where they can push on a woman's stomach, try and get the baby to turn around, but they stopped that at 35 weeks. And so they won't do it after that. So she said, no, we prayed to Father Solanus, and they did a novena. And doctors gave that procedure 1 to 2% chance of success. So they made her sign a waiver that she could die in the procedure. They said, if something happens to you, we're operating on you and taking that child. She said, okay. So she signed all the paperwork. They did the procedure. The child was delivered naturally, no injury to the child or the mother. And their family contributes that completely to Father Solanus. And I mean, this is just weekly kinds of things that happen around him. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to have Brother come up and offer to let you venerate the relic, anything you want to touch there. There is a mission flyer. I forgot to pass those out. Oh, you got the mission flyer. And then
There's more badges. There's
some
more
more
badges
badges
out there.
If you can get one, or take one to somebody who might be here. And thank you for coming. Tomorrow night is the finish of the mission, and I will give the apostolic blessing that imparts the plenary indulgence. Tomorrow evening, the topic is the Blessed Mother and the Holy Eucharist. A very moving, very interesting sermon on that subject, and with Mass again tomorrow evening. So we'll start the Rosary at 6, and we'll start Mass right on the nose at 6:30. Okay? And I will be available for confessions and stories.
Okay. I just want to mention one other story, Father, as well, was to the fact that, talking about Padre Pio, it was to the fact that there was a family that came to Father Solanus asking for blessings. Got that mixed up there. It was an Italian family who had gone over to Italy, and they visited Padre Pio. And when they went in to visit him, he said, "Why did you come all this way? You have someone in Detroit."